In one corner, you have Donald Trump's transactional approach to globalization. In the other, Beijing's big Belt and Roads Build Now, Pay Later infrastructure initiative. And in the middle, there's Macron, France's president, welcoming Xi Jinping for a state visit where the host decided to call for backup this Tuesday. After the easy part, the state banquet, the signing of the mega deals, Emmanuel Macron inviting in German Chancellor Angela Merkel, flanked by European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker. Better than a cumbersome EU-China summit with dozens of people around the table, 4 sitting down. That meant getting down to it on issues like subsidies and dumping, intellectual property, accusations of spying leveled against next-generation 5G player Huawei. And then, of course, there's Belt and Road itself. Should it be viewed as an opportunity or as a threat to the rest of Europe? When Italy's populist coalition signs on, as it did officially last Saturday, to Beijing's Silk Road Initiative, is it, as critics call it, a debt trap that makes partners beholden to China, both financially and strategically? Is that any different than being beholden to U.S. tech giants in finance? We will ask our panel today in the France 24 debate how Europe is handling China. And with us, Jean-François Di Meglio, the president of the Asia Center. Hello. Thank you for joining us. I want to thank as well commentator and investor André Lezekrug-Pietri, founder of A Capital. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you again.
Nice to welcome back as well from the Belgian capital, Solange Gouault-Chatelain, research associate at the Free University of Brussels. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Good evening.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, 4-way sit-down at the Élysée Palace. Claire Rush has more.
More reciprocity. At a meeting in Paris on Tuesday, the leaders of France, Germany, and the EU sought to boost relations with their Chinese counterpart, notably on issues of trade and climate change, while also putting pressure on Beijing over its business practices. This in a bid to present a united front against China's economic expansion into Europe.
We have differences, but we respect China, and we are committed to dialogue and cooperation. We expect our partner to respect the EU and its values in return.
Despite French President Emmanuel Macron's call for unity in the face of China, Europe remains divided in its relations with Beijing. Over the weekend, the Italian government became the first G7 state to sign on to Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative, a mass infrastructure project linking Asia to Europe. The EU has expressed concerns over Beijing's initiative, noting that important elements of European infrastructure, like power networks and ports, are already in Chinese hands, a concern that led German Chancellor Angela Merkel to call for more EU participation in the project.
Germany wants to participate in China's One Belt, One Road initiative, the new Silk Road. I believe this is a very important project. We as Europeans want to play an active role in the project. That means there must be a certain reciprocity, which we're still wrangling over a bit.
At Tuesday's meeting, Chinese President Xi Jinping echoed EU leaders' calls for cooperation, while urging both sides to overcome their suspicions. The 4 leaders will meet again in Brussels next month for an EU-China summit.
So there you have it, 2 acts. Act 1 on Monday, a state banquet with celebrities, including the French actor Alain Delon, the signing of these mega deals, including the purchase of all these Airbus planes by China. And then Act 2, when you get to the nitty-gritty, difficult discussions, Macron calls in Angela Merkel and Jean-Claude Juncker. Why did he do that? Why just 4 people at the table?
Well, to make something happen, I would say, because at the first stage, when you looked at the agenda of this visit by Xi Jinping, this visit by Xi Jinping to France was basically a visit between a big deal, which was Italy joining Belt and Road Initiative, and a trip to the US. Basically, Xi Jinping was supposed to fly to the US to Mar-a-Lago to discuss the trade deal, and that was cancelled. So at the end of the day, you had a visit to France which was boiling down to pure protocol, because President Macron has committed to go to China every year, but in turn, he's got to get a visit by the Chinese president in between. So the visit was at the beginning pure protocol. And then, of course, Act 2, as you said, made something happen. I think, in a way, that's the end of the beginning with the EU-China relation. I don't know whether it's the beginning of a new beginning, we will see, but it's something very different, which many, many observers had expected and were really longing for.
And forgive me for asking this, because we are in the run-up to European elections on this continent. Is this about China, or is this Macron's way of saying, look, I'm the leader of Europe?
Well, it's an opportunity. But of course, it serves President Macron's interest. But it had to happen at one point of time. And that was probably the very good slot to have it happen, because there was not much on the agenda. Look at the signing. Of course, the Airbuses are a massive deal, because 290 A320, 10 350, that's a mega deal, 35 billion euros, which will take time to accomplish. But beyond that, there was no big deal to be signed. So there was room for the agenda to be filled up with this, and that's a very good idea.
Yeah, Solange, we have those EU-China summits that take place regularly. It's difficult getting attention for them on the news cycle. Whereas here, the fact that it was Macron and just Merkel and Juncker, what did you make of that?
I mean, in my opinion, I think it was very clear signaling, tactical signaling from Macron, from, let's say, the deep establishment of the European institutions, saying, we don't really like you sort of picking and choosing individual countries to do business with. It's really, I think, a coordinated tactical response to China gaining grounds, critical grounds in Europe, in the EU. And I think Europe essentially is welcoming China as a peer, as a partner. And I think it ultimately welcomes business, as the Airbus deal shows. But I think what it also wants to do, and what it did through this meeting in Paris, to show that at least Macron was really leading the way in a more unified European response, and saying, yes, so Italy has endorsed, I mean, it's the first G7 country to sort of break away from the ranks of the original G7 group. And it's signed and it's endorsed the deal with China. It's not the first European country to do so, but it's the first, let's say, significant country to do so. It's the first founding member state of the European Union to do so. And Macron, flanked by his two sides by Juncker and Merkel, the European establishment, elite, or the power brokers of Europe, if you like, are saying, well, we would like you to engage perhaps in a more integrated or united way. Essentially the question, the really challenging question is put to China is, does China want to be seen in Europe as a country that is acting to undermine European unity, so picking and choosing its potential economic partners and allies, or does it want to have a more cohesive and comprehensive approach to how it conducts business on the European continent? So I think this was a kind of not so subtle way, but extremely diplomatic kind of coup de force by Macron, and that's what he's good at, saying, yes, you come to France, and this is a bilateral meeting, but when you're dealing with a European country today in 2019 in what we call a post-European order, or a post-American Europe, or a post-American world order, you're actually dealing not just with France, but with all my friends. So you're dealing with Europe too. So I think it's, it's signaling, and this is what this relationship is all about.
Signaling, but concretely, when you see the Chinese invest in strategic industries, invest, for instance, in the port of Piraeus in Greece, in Portugal's big energy provider, that is always going to ruffle feathers elsewhere on the continent. Can there be European unity?
Well, first of all, the question should be, how did Greece and Portugal and the southern European countries get into these positions in the first place? And I think the Piraeus port is a very good example. We often hear about predatory lending coming from China, and there are reasons, of course, to be concerned, and I think we should be monitoring the risks of Chinese economic diplomacy in Europe. But just as much as we should be also monitoring the risks of predatory lending within Europe. And if you actually put it to the Greeks, they will probably tell you that a lot of their debt is not owed to China at the moment, it's owed to private German and French banks. So, I think the monitoring and of what, the potential risk that, further entanglement, further engagement with China entails should not be sort of the pet project of European think tanks based in London, Stockholm and Berlin. But I think it should be the concern of European policymakers all across the board and all across the parties, and we should apply that kind of cautious monitoring to European private lending, just as we should apply it to American private lending. I mean, ultimately, Europe has been struggling to recover from a deep financial crisis, which was essentially, given to us. We caught the cold from America. Why? Because of very dangerous, irresponsible lending by American financial markets. So we have to be a little bit more cautious. This is just to sort of put things back into context. And if you look at the Piraeus, for example, port, which is, I think, a very good example, the Greeks were not left with a choice, and strategically they were sort of tactically put into that position where they would not have a choice. If you speak to the successive Greek finance ministers who succeeded themselves on negotiating this deal, I think some finance ministers, like Yanis Varoufakis, who managed to secure an interesting deal with Beijing, apparently that deal was then vetoed by Berlin. And that was just before he resigned. Then he resigned. He said he got a better deal. He said he got a better price for the port. He said he also got Chinese on board to finance their railways. So what he did was he saw a very bad deal that was signed between the Greeks and the Chinese. He said, this is terrible. So he called the Chinese and said, let's renegotiate. And apparently, according to him, they were quite open to renegotiation. And they said, fine, we're long-term investors. We're patient investors. We're here for 100 years. We don't want to ruffle anybody's feathers. We're playing the long game. So what would make you happy? And so Yanis negotiated a particular deal. He wanted more for the port. He wanted more infrastructure financing. But that deal was vetoed, apparently, according to him. We have to, that's what he says. And then his successor apparently negotiated a terrible deal where, the terms were very different. They got a lower price, and then they sold the railways for close to nothing to a private Italian company, actually. So I'm just saying I would like to invite the viewers to really think about the bigger issues, to look at what are the dynamics, that are being, scrutinized, and say that's good. We should be scrutinizing this. We should be doing more careful research and investigation. Yeah. But, we should do it across the board, within Europe, at home first, but also with America, and especially in this very volatile period of, where the transatlantic relation is going through a fundamental transition.
Yeah, and again, it's part of the world becoming a more interdependent place where strategic sectors of the economy overlap from one country to the other. You might say that the acid test right now, when it comes to the relationship between the US, the EU, and China, is in tech and in telecoms. Before first meeting Macron on the French Riviera on Sunday, Xi Jinping was welcomed by Prince Albert of Monaco. Monaco, which last year sealed a deal to get Chinese telecoms giant Huawei to develop its burgeoning 5G telecommunications network. And we have some breaking news on that, André Lezecourt-Petri, which is that the European Commission announcing this Tuesday that they're not going to go along with what the United States wants, which is to shut Huawei out of the European market.
Well, first I wanted to react. It's the first time I hear that Varoufakis' words should be taken for face value, because he said so many things and the opposite that I'm not so sure that he should be taken as a source. But that being said, first I want to say about this visit, there is something radically new, is that it's the first time that France became realistic about its relationship with China. And I think we will see that in the telecom too. it was supposed to be a visit where we celebrate with all the honors the 55th anniversary of what the French are so proud of, is that they were the first ones to recognize the People's
First
Republic.
major power to recognize.
Nobody almost talked about it. It was very little acknowledged. And to take the bon mot of one of the commissioners of the European Commission, as you know, there are two kind of countries in Europe, the small countries and those who don't know they are small. And France probably finally had its recognition that negotiating alone with China makes no sense. We will always have the lower hand. And I think what's happening here is just finally realism happening. And I think this is really new. And that should be applauded from the part of President Macron. And regarding the Huawei part, indeed, I don't think it's for the honor of the prince, even if he's very charming. I'm sure of the beauty of Monaco that he went, because Monaco became the first country or sovereign state that completely goes to 5G equipped with Huawei. And I think that's a not so subtle way of the Chinese president to massively support his giant. The problem with the European is that we're in a terrible dilemma. Is either we take Huawei, which according to telecom experts, has a 12, 18 months advance on its technological roadmap compared to the two other competitors who are Nokia and Ericsson.
And it's cheaper.
And it's cheaper. And we have an edge on what actually telecom enables. Autonomous driving, IoT, the future of industry, predictive maintenance, which are probably the future of European industry. Or we go, but if we take them, there is this whole question about, is there any security leak? Are we becoming dependent on this infrastructure? So in any case, the choice for the European was a bad choice. Either we are late or we become dependent.
And it's ironic, isn't it, that the French themselves are divided in the sense that you have four big telecom operators. Two of them work with Huawei and two of them don't.
Yeah, well,
or at least domestically.
The fact that we are for a 65 million people country is absolutely crazy. The US have 4 operators themselves for a much larger one. So I'm not, linked with any of them, but realize that what the problem we have in Europe right now is that we always believe in this ideology of customer first. So we try to divide and have 36 operators in Europe. So what's the conclusion of that is none of them has really the capacity to invest massively. And so we are only going for price. And, I would be a telecom operator. I would also go for price. And obviously Huawei, who is using its massive national market and the fact that they used very smartly African markets, for example, to have the scale, have a competitive advantage, which will be increasingly difficult to... So what we need from policymakers is understanding that the world has changed and that investment in research and development is critical for future competitiveness and future jobs.
All right, we're going to talk about this with the rest of our panel when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at the state visit by China's president to France, one which this Tuesday brought in as well the German chancellor, the president of the European Commission. With us to talk about it is Jean-François Di president of the Asia Center. Also with us, commentator and investor André Lezekrug-Petry, founder of A Capital, and from the Belgian capital, Solange Guillot-Chatelard, research associate at the Free University of Brussels. We were talking about the telecoms giant Huawei, which has been in the news, what with the daughter of the founder who's in that extradition process from Canada to the United States. Canadians have been arrested in retaliation, and suspicions that run deep over whether or not, because of the ties between Huawei and the state apparatus, of whether or not it's a big player when it comes to whether it's a security threat. Now, last October, Jean-François Dimegdo, let's just remind viewers here of a little incident that happened. Altice, which is the parent company of French telecoms companies, SFR, unveiled its new headquarters in the southwest of Paris, not far from here, by the way. It landed itself in hot water by showing off its new 5G network powered by Huawei. Problem is, as you can see on the map, Well, the Altice campus is right next door to the new headquarters of the French Defense Ministry. Also, you're not supposed to deploy 5G inside Paris yet. It hasn't been approved. It's sort of an unwritten rule.
Correct,
But
yeah.
the fact that is that it just shows to what degree there's an uneasiness, right, when it comes
Well,
to...
you didn't show on the map where Huawei's headquarters are in Paris, just across the Seine River.
Yeah,
You know
just
that,
outside the city limits.
Yes, but just it's not much further away from the armies, the Ministry of Armies. Now, as you said, Huawei, BH, with those operators who are working with them or with the other ones, is not supposed to be allowed to work in Île-de-France, in the Paris region. Wherever Huawei has access in France, it's outside of the Paris region with those operators they work with. And last question, which is how much physical proximity has an impact or not when you are so powerful in terms of telecom. It was an issue. You spoke about Monaco, for example. Of course, the proximity has an impact. The fact that Monaco probably also is to sign a deal on underwater cables, which were denied by France when it was proposed that Marseille would be a terminal for the submarine cables, shows that the physical impact, the physical proximity, has an impact. So is
it a security risk? Is Huawei a security risk, or any more of a security risk than its rivals?
If you want to use the principle of precaution, yes, of course, because there are things that you don't necessarily totally master. Having said that, and just being back to the US and being back to competition in the telecom business, supposedly Huawei is very much advanced, and if they are advanced, they are probably more prone to borrowing information or technology from others or spying, as you say. But every telecom operator, every high-tech company is willing to borrow or to take some technology from the competitors. That's the rule of the game. And now, speaking of about the extradition process, yes, probably the reason for the extradition process is the fact that Huawei broke rules on embargoes by the US, but it's a part of the trade bargain between the US and China. That's all part of the same picture.
And this middle path that the EU is trying to forge, saying, yes, we're going to keep on doing business with Huawei. We're not going to listen to what the Americans say, but we're going to keep close tabs on it. Will that work?
Well, I'm not a telecom expert,
right? So
my answer has to be qualified. In France, we do have some expertise in technology. Speaking about how advanced Huawei is in terms of 5G, it's not even sure how much can 5G can take you to, because yes, we spoke about autonomous cars. It's far from really being working at this stage. So 5G, yes, Huawei is more advanced than the others. Whether that really applies to those technologies which are advertised by Huawei, 5G and so on and so forth, it probably needs some more reach. And where is that reach? Probably in Europe. There are things that Huawei cannot achieve and that you can probably achieve through European technologies. Hence the match and hence the discussion which took place in Paris about transfer of technologies.
I want to welcome at this point to our conversation from London, Alessio Patalano, who teaches East Asian warfare and security at the Department of War Studies at King's College London. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.
Good evening.
We've been talking about Huawei. We've been talking about the meeting that took place earlier at the French presidential palace. Before traveling to France, though, it was last Saturday. Italy becoming the first G7 nation to officially sign on to China's Belt and Road Initiative, with most notably the development of the port of Genoa, investment in the port of Trieste, which is, by the way, located near a U.S. military base, and also a partnership between Italian energy company Eni and the Bank of China. The partnership with China, well, it divides Italy's coalition government. The far-right League is wary. The five-star movement, as you're about to hear, is all for it.
Our objective with this agreement is to start to rebalance a disproportion that means that so much made in China comes to Italy and too little made in Italy goes to China. As someone said in the United States, America first, I keep repeating Italia first in trade relations. And therefore, no one wants to go over our European partners. We remain well united in the Euro-Atlantic Alliance, we remain allies of the United States, and in NATO.
Alessio Patalano, you agree with Italy's Deputy Prime Minister, Luigi Di Maio?
Yes, well, I think here the question has to be divided into two different types of issues. The agreement that was signed, obviously from an economic point of view, it's something that is to be expected. It's something that builds on a complementary nature of things that the Italian economy can offer to the Chinese economy, and that the Chinese economy can offer to the Italian economy. So, and there were already an incredible amount of investment from China going into Italy. So in a way, it consolidates, it provides a framework, and it sort of widens the agenda and the options for the two countries to enhance that sort of collaboration. But I think the different sort of question, the one that has raised so many eyebrows, particularly in DC, has to do with the political symbolism around the fact that Italy, as a member of the European Union, as a member of the G7, is the first country in that context to politically give an element of rubber stamping of the Belt and Road Initiative, raising a lot of questions regarding the political nature.
Oh, we seem to have lost the connection there with London. We'll try to reconnect. Solange Guyot-Chatelard, your thoughts? Is this just a political announcement? What does this signify? Italy joining the Belt and Road Initiative.
I think. The previous speaker in London is right. I think it signifies several things. There's a lot of positioning, repositioning, strategic repositioning, not just vis-à-vis China, but I think it's also Italy vis-à-vis the rest of Europe, which goes to the sort of the north-south tension that I referred to earlier, that has been exacerbated by the financial crisis, and the sluggish recovery since then. I think essentially Italy is saying we're not benefiting from this, EU environment anymore. We're not benefiting from this. We're not seeing the benefits in our economy. We have stagnant growth. We doesn't really see its economy going anywhere. It has, crippling debt, and it's shouldering most of the migration crisis, and it's, carrying most of the weight of the migration crisis. So it's under, quite high distress, and it's saying, well, I want other options on the table. It's looking at what America is doing. America is, in a process of redefining the transatlantic relationship, radically and fundamentally redefining it, and it's going it alone. And the irony is that sort of Italy is ignoring the American sort of lobbying and request to ignore the Belt and Road Initiative, and it's actually said, well, actually, we're going to go it alone. They tore a page out of, Trump's foreign policy handbook and said Italy's also going it alone. And it's looking for a win-win deal, a win-win partnership with China. It's basically really looking for markets for its products, Italian companies, products and services, which essentially focus on high-end luxury goods and services that are doing very well in China, actually. And it's also looking for, China's deep pockets to buy Italian debt. It wants to issue new bonds and get new sources of financing through FDI, but also, long-term state financing. So I think Italy knows what it can gain. It can gain economically. It thinks it's going to gain politically and strategically by aligning itself with someone else. I think it was the Italian economy minister who said, in order to justify Italy's position, that, he quoted an old Italian saying that if you're not at the dinner table, you will be on the menu. And, essentially Italy gave us Machiavelli 500 years ago. So, what more do we really need? They're being strategic, they're being tactical. China has, of course, immense interest in getting as close to individual European states as possible. It has access to ports, it has access to Italian technology.
Let me bring in on this point, Andrea Lozakug-Pietri. Is it win-win between Italy and China?
Look, I don't think that anything will change in the interest of China, who is already heavily investing in Italy. It bought Ansaldo, it bought some shipyard, it bought most famously Pirelli, which has been bought by ChemChina. So I'm not so sure it's going to bring a lot more, because despite all the political push, investments by Chinese investors were not always only driven by political reasons. They were driven also by good interests. And I always remind that even with countries which has difficulties with China, for example, Norway at one point, it did not stop investors to come in or to come out. So I don't think it's going to bring more to Italy. For China, it's a huge win, because one, it shows indeed, like was said, that a G7 country is now part of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a major political win. Secondly, it shows actually the weakening of the US influence very clearly. And third, it shows clear European fragmentation. And that's the only thing where, even if I'm personally French and German, I'm always a bit worried when I see the French and the Germans trying to do European politics, because it always creates reaction among the northern states, the Dutch, the Irish, the Polish, and the Italians, that again, French and German leaders think that they can do Europe on their own, and I think we have.
And the Italians are doing the same, is what you're saying.
Well, and we see this fragmentation under our eyes, and the last thing is, we should not underestimate the capacity of the Chinese to ride the wave of symbolism. You mentioned Trieste. Let's not forget that Trieste was the major port of what we call Middle Europa, this big, European empire that was in the 19th and early 20th century, really the heart of Europe. And that's through Trieste that people were accessing that. So the Chinese are extremely good at giving the Italians the pride that they unfortunately lost.
Alessio Patalano, you agree?
Most things, but I would be even more sort of radical in terms of saying this is not a win-win. Because, as the previous speaker was quite rightly pointing out, the amount of investment that China was going to make into Italy, it's already there. It's already a trend. So how much more you can get out of it? I think the real issue here is the political symbolism about it. And this political symbolism has three main components. One, this is a statement that the Italians are sending to the European Union and their European colleagues. They're not happy. They haven't been happy. In fact, the current government has been put in power because of that sense of unhappiness that goes a long way back down to 2014-15 migration crisis, in which the European Union systematically allowed for a populist voice to ride that wave of a lack of support from their European counterparts. And it's been currently playing out in the tensions between France and Italy. So there is a tremendous domestic element signaling here towards the European, the Italian sort of end, as in, we're not happy. And don't think for a second you can be our only sort of answer to our problems. Look what we're going to do with the Chinese. There's a second element to this, and that is really sort of the symbolism around how the Italians are de facto providing support through a political statement, joining the BRI, to this vision, basically brushing under the carpet all the problems that come with the Belt and Road Initiative, as we've seen in parts of Eastern Africa, as well as in the Indian Ocean, most notably Ethiopia, Kenya, and Sri Lanka, just to name a few countries that have seen the darker sides of debt-led traps as related to the Belt and Road Initiative. And the third element...
Yeah, but Italy, so let me interrupt you there. Italy's a developed economy. It's not going to fall into a debt trap the way Sri Lanka or the Maldives will.
Well, I would beg to differ slightly on this point, because the mention to the port of Trieste that was made earlier on raises a very interesting question. The type of port that Trieste is likely to remain or to become within the Belt and Road Initiative is very similar to other ports in central, sort of across the Mediterranean region. It would be in direct competition, for example, with Piraeus in Greece. So the question is, how do the Chinese plan on increasing the volume of intra-regional shipping to a point that all these new investments in Italy, which are in direct competition with other similar realities within Southern Europe, are going to thrive altogether? I'm not necessarily sure. Also, there is a systematic problem with Belt and Road Initiative that are related to the lack of transparency through which these investments are conducted, and the degree to which government have to commit themselves in order to support them. Now, it's been said moments ago about how the Italians want the Chinese to buy part of their debt. That creates a very dangerous sort of type of mix. Look, at the end of the day, what I find very interesting is that here we're facing a situation whereby the Italians seem to play the Machiavelli card 500 years a little bit too late, as in like we managed to find a way to get something out of the Chinese. But this is all but clear because the agreement economically doesn't say much more in terms of what it is exactly that specifically the Italians are gaining in terms of investment, money, and economic interaction with China that doesn't already exist, whilst at the same time they are politically giving a lot in terms of recognizing a vision that in practical terms has provided and raised many questions, just as many questions as sort of solutions it has tried to offer.
Just very briefly, because we're almost out of time, Solange Guyot-Chatelain, I know a lot of your research has focused on the role of China in Africa, and I just want to bring it back to Emmanuel Macron for 1 minute. He recently made this trip of Eastern Africa. He did not go to former French colonies, except for Djibouti. The other countries he visited were Ethiopia and Kenya, and China came up a lot in conversation. He talked about it with the Ethiopian leadership. The Ethiopian leadership just right now trying to renegotiate its debt when it comes to that railway project with Beijing. What did you think of Macron's words and his message to China when he was in East Africa?
I mean, I can't really, I don't know what's going on in Macron's head, and I don't want to pull words out of his mouth, but just for some context, you know, France has the largest foreign military presence on the African continent, so it has critical strategic interests there. And China is not a competitor on the military front in terms of hard power yet. Although that it has got, of course, military ambitions, and it's training a growing sort of peacekeeping force that it's now positioning all across the continent. For example, even sending emergency crisis aid to Mozambique, areas that are devastated through natural disaster. But the Horn of Africa is really a very critical strategic region in and of itself. I mean, we're talking a lot about Ethiopia. Ethiopia has been one of the privileged partners on the African continent with China. It's had relatively smooth relations. That doesn't mean they're not problematic, but if you compare it to countries like Zambia in southern Central Africa, where I work, other countries that have much more critical governments, Ethiopia and China, let's say, get along. They agree on certain things that maybe other governments don't. But Ethiopia is also very, very important for Europe, because that's where a lot of European money is going now to contain the migration crisis. And we forget that, you know, the European Union is essentially financing, you know, the extension and the expansion of its borders. You know, European borders don't stop at the Mediterranean now. They stop halfway down Niger. They're in Libya. They're in Ethiopia. Ethiopia. They're even going down to Kenya and Somaliland, where, you know, there's a vacuum of power, which creates the conditions for mass migration, which is what we're seeing, you know. And so Ethiopia is very smart. It's playing its cards very well. It has recently elected a new leader who's very smart and who also sort of buys into the message of multilateralism. You know, let's focus on security. Let's focus on peace. Let's get along with our neighbors. Let's reach out to Eritrea, and it's saying, you know, and it's playing its cards well, and it's, you know, on its way to becoming a regional hegemon, on a steady path to becoming a regional hegemon. And it's taking money from China. It's taking money from the European Union.
And hence the visit there. We're running short on time. Solange Guyot-Chatelain, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Brussels. I want to thank as well Alessio Patalano for being with us from London, André Lezekrug-Petry, Jean-François Di Meglio. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, Francois. So just to look at some of the reactions and analysis about this trip to Paris by Xi Jinping. Behind the niceties of the Chinese leader's visit, says the New York Times, France is wary. And of course, we've been seeing that tone being struck not just during the visit, but indeed prior to it. They speak about Macron's sharpened words resonating as the template for France's attitude towards China. This is when Xi was welcomed at the Arc de Triomphe, a symbol of French imperial power, with words saying, you know, when you're speaking to France, you're speaking to Europe. So very much a warning in many senses, maybe a subtle warning about the fact that Europe wants to remain united in this regard, despite the fact that we've been seeing lots of division. Now, vis-a-vis those concerns, not to kind of go into too much details about them, they're certainly being dismissed in Chinese state media such as Xinhua.net here. China and France, they need to develop relationships of mutual trust, practical cooperation and friendly sentiments between the two peoples, which I think, again, reading between the lines, is a bit of a dismissal of this notion that China is only operating out of self-interest. The Washington Post also speaks about this trip to Europe. China lays down a marker in Europe. They speak extensively in this piece about the trip to Italy, where the fact that, of course, Italy signed on to the Belt and Roads Initiative, China's strategic development plan, is seen by Europe as not being a team player within Europe. But Italian officials argue that they are in a better position to handle Chinese investment without the fear of surrendering sovereignty. That's the fear that is based on examples such as Sri Lanka, where people have ended up in debt traps in these projects. You can see this article in Quartz talking about China's debt trap diplomacy was under siege in 2018. Again, articles in Xinhua really dismissing those ideas. This one here, ciao, I think they're meaning more hello than goodbye. Hello, Marco Polo, reference to the
we had a
Silk
lot of
Road.
Machiavelli references during the debate. I was expecting more Marco Polo.
Right, well, he's there. I think he's present all right. But this piece in Xinhua says that the Chinese president, it's if I can find the right reference, that essentially this is a win-win situation, the Belt and Roads Initiative, that Italy is a major global economic player. It has its own rights and ability to identify where its national interests lie. And perhaps the killer line, the Belt and Road skeptics need to discard their obsolete zero-sum mentality and move beyond ideological entrenchment. So essentially, coming out of the Chinese media, you would think that China really is acting 100% completely benevolently in the world with this Belt and Roads Initiative, that it's really a win-win situation in all examples, except I suppose in parts of Asia we can see that that's not the case. And certainly I think when it comes to strategic cooperation, it's hard to see where that's possible in Africa, where France is simply a strategic competitor with China when it comes to investments in China.
Just a competitor? Jean-François.
Well, you know that's the word which was used by the European Commission just before Xi Jinping arrived in Europe. China was defined as a strategic competitor to Europe, and today Juncker amended the word, saying that someone is a strategic competitor is just a recognition that it's powerful and it's not at all a critical issue. I mean, we like having strategic competitors, but the word is out now. Yes, China is a strategic competitor. It was not the case before.
All right, Jean-François Dumaigle, I want to thank you. I want to thank James Creedon.
Thanks, François.
I want to thank our panel. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.